Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Hangout with the Buck Institute for Education. I'm John Larmer, the Editor-in-Chief here at BIE. And this week we'll be talking about assessing student learning. It's one of our gold standard PBL project-based teaching practices. So a few logistics. This Hangout is being archived. So if you want to watch it later or tell people about it, it'll be on the BIE.org website. And it'll last about 30 minutes, plus or minus a few. You're free to ask questions, welcome to, on the Google Plus events page, and I'll relay them to our guests. And if we can't get to all your questions, we can answer them offline later on our Google Plus page. And let me have our guests introduce themselves first, members of our esteemed national faculty, and then I'll say more about our topic, and then we'll get going. So, who we got here, folks?
I'll start. My name is Andrew Miller. I've been with the Buck Institute for Education on their national faculty for a few years now, and I recently took a position at the Shanghai American School in Shanghai, where I'll be serving as an instructional coach.
Yay, Andrew.
I'm Michelle Spencer. I was a high school English teacher doing project-based learning in the 90s. I started teaching in 1991, integrated ninth grade English, science, and art. I was principal of New Technology High School in Napa, which is the flagship school of the New Tech Network, and I now work for EdSurge as the Director of Summits and Professional Learning.
Okay, welcome, Michelle.
And I'm Kelly Reseigh. I am currently a professional learning partner with Denver Public Schools, formerly an elementary school teacher for about 10 years doing PBL in my classroom, and now work with teachers, principals, and instructional superintendents in increasing the quality of their work. So super excited to be here.
All right, welcome, Kelly, and go Broncos, of course. Okay, so our topic then today, assessing student learning. We made this one of the project-based teaching practices in our new model of gold standard PBL. And you can read about that on our website. We have blogs and articles about our model for gold standard PBL. It was drawn from our book with ASCD called Setting the Standard for PBL. So check that out if you wish. And as I said, feel free to ask questions. Remember, this is being archived, and let's go. So my first question is just sort of a general introduction to the topic. What do we mean by assessing student learning in a PBL context, and why is it important enough to be one of our project-based teaching practices? So what do you think, guys?
I'll go. I really believe in assessment, and I know that there are different expectations around what that looks like, but I think assessment within PBL is especially important, not necessarily because it's just best practice, but specifically because kids need to know where they're at and what they need to do to continue to grow in relation to what the standards are saying, and then personally what their goals are and what they've set for themselves, both in skills and understanding. I have had so many teachers, and I myself as a teacher at one point was like, I know my kids right here, like I know them, but that wasn't enough, because it's not enough for teachers to know their kids, it's important for kids to know themselves, and so that assessment really unveils that and allows them the opportunity to really reflect and see where they're going.
I just want to repeat. That's a great point, Kelly. I just wanted to say that one more time. It's important for students to know themselves, not just in the teacher's head. I like that. All right, go ahead. Michelle, you were going to say something?
Well, I was struck too. Kelly, I fully agree. It's really about the feedback that students are hungry for to know how they're doing. And when they're given feedback, it really does help them grow and develop. And honestly, I think that kind of assessment can be very celebratory and a very powerful experience, even if they're not quite there yet. So I think assessment is a great opportunity to show growth and to celebrate in a positive way.
Right, to connect with that growth idea, right? These projects often are very long, sometimes they're 2 to 3 weeks or longer, and so with that, we all have to know where we're at throughout the process, like where am I at the end of the, these first few days as a student. Teachers know at the end of week 1 where are my students and how do I adjust. So without assessment, a project going to flop. I mean, you won't know what you need instructionally to do next. And of course, from the design perspective, you need to know where you want your students to go. Now, you can be flexible in that, of course, but when you design a project, you know, to use the phrase, begin with the end in mind, you want to know these are the learning goals I want for my students, and how do we all get there? But there's an intentionality to it.
Yes.
Okay. All right, thanks for the intro, guys. And I should mention that all of these folks are national faculty have conducted our PBL 101 workshops, in some cases probably hundreds of them, Andrew, in your case. And this question of assessment is an important one. So we spent all of day 2 of our 3-day PBL 101 workshop talking about assessment. And so I want to ask you guys, just when you do the workshop or just in your own coaching of teachers and your own work, what are the best practices for assessment in PBL?
Well, something I think that's really important to remember is that this is focused on the word assessment. It doesn't say grading. I always like to say this: assess more, grade less. We all have limited time as educators to do all that, and I think it's important, you know, as Michelle said, you've got to give that critical feedback to students, and that does take time, but that doesn't mean you need to be putting it in for a grade, and especially if we want students to feel like they can grow, if they can grow throughout the process of a project, right, and that, you know, I may be here, but I can get here. A grade may or may not, you know, hinder that. It might actually make a student feel like, oh, I thought I could grow, but now I have a grade and I can't improve it. So I think thinking about that grading, yes, there will be a grades associated with it, but I think that we need to move the conversation towards more assessment and not necessarily grading.
And one of the most important kinds of assessment is an informal sort of assessment. When I was principal, I used to make sure I was in classrooms for as many hours a week as I possibly could, and I made it a priority. And I'd walk into every classroom and I'd ask students, what are you learning? And the interesting thing is, oftentimes they mistakenly tell you what they're doing. I'm building a bridge, you know, I'm generating something with a magnet, but it's like, but what are you learning? And as soon as a student can express in their own words what they're learning, and you actually recognize kids speak of a state standard, you kind of know something is really happening there. And that sort of harkens back to Kelly's notion of kids assessing themselves and simply asking the question, what are you learning? It was very revealing to the students and of course, to me as an administrator.
Yeah, absolutely. That idea of reflection within students is probably one of the best practices I could encourage with assessment, just that we're really helping kids understand themselves and what their next steps are. And that means that we need to be a little transparent with the assessment process. And a lot of times that's you know, really held by the teacher, and that shared ownership of the assessment and really bringing kids into that process. So there's no gotcha moments. You know, and that is again, really supported too by differentiated assessment. So that idea of grading that you were talking about, Andrew, lends itself to you know, everyone getting the same thing at the same time, the same assessment at the same time, in the same way. And I think that we can do better than that. And so really considering what are some different ways, what are some different methods, what are some different times that you might assess kids along the way, so that they really are getting that assessment to move them forward and not having it be a hindrance, feeling like a block keeping them back.
Right, and I'd love to add the point there, you know, the differentiation, you know, that connects to the voice and choice, you know, gold standard piece there too, that we're offering voice and choice and how students want to be assessed. You know, they can say, I want to show what I know in this way, and you know, and that there's that ownership in the assessment process. Traditionally, it's always teachers assessing. I think there's a video on Edutopia that, you know, something that we're trying to turn the process back to students, where assessment is not just done to them, and I think that's probably one of the most, as you said, the most important parts of assessment in a project.
And I suppose it goes without saying, we all have assumed, too, that one of the best practices with assessment is a tool that students understand, right? So, you know, just in case we need to say it, you know, having a rubric and spending significant time making sure students understand the rubric, are normed and calibrated with the rubric, practice with it on each other and themselves, so that it's not a teacher owning assessment, as Kelly had said. But, you know, so I think the best kind of rubric includes some kind of reference to risk-taking, or creativity, because if you really want students to feel emboldened to have voice and choice and to invest themselves, you kind of have to call out that opportunity for them to be able to take a risk and reveal their true self, or to insert creativity into any project. So I love tools that leave space for that.
Yeah, so that's a great point with bringing up that skills also need to be assessed, that really is part of the assessment and not just the standards themselves, and utilizing that growth continuum for both skills and level of understanding and knowledge is really important.
Right, and it's good that, I mean, there are rubrics out there for things like collaboration and critical thinking, and those are just as important as the content that we want. They're transferable, as you said. I think another one that I was thinking of when we're thinking about it is that, you know, we talk about PBL projects are highly collaborative, right? So they're obviously our team products, but we got to make sure that there's some sort of individual component too, right? Because at the end of the day, we want to see that every child in our classroom walks away knowing, you know, whatever we set out to have them learn, and the voice and choice can be there. But, you know, sometimes when we think about, oh, there's all this collaboration, we might forget that, yes, but don't forget, individually students want to show what they know too. So I think it's a both. It's a balanced piece.
Yeah, those formative assessments are a great opportunity to do that individual assessment, you know, and also assessing collaboration along the way, but building in many formative assessments in order to do that individual reflection and feedback.
Great points, guys. If I could just summarize a couple of things I heard. You mentioned the value of student reflection and ownership as part of the process of assessment. So it's not just done to them by the teacher. Great point. The transparency idea. Kelly, you mentioned content and skills. It's not just content standards we're assessing in PBL. And it's individual work, not just team created product, which is a big deal, of course, when it comes to grading and reporting, too. Michelle, I like your point about putting creativity or risk-taking on a rubric. And now you're not saying, though, actually assess the degree to which a student is creative, right? It's more like, are they doing things that a person who's innovative does, like, you know, trying out ideas, testing them, getting feedback, learning from mistakes, that kind of thing?
Yeah, definitely. And in different content areas, you know, you want to call out different things, but you know, just a space somewhere where students can recognize I invested something genuine of myself into this, and that can feel risky to them.
Yeah. Okay, great point. And I wanted to say, Andrew, another word or two about grading, because this is a big one. And you said something which may become a bomb in some people's minds. Don't grade so much. Don't grade everything, every little assignment during a project, for example, which runs counter to many teachers' practices, and sometimes what they're required to do, of course, for reporting. So, you want to say a little more about the grading and PBL issue?
Well, it is a beast, as you said, and it opens up a lot of cultural underpinnings. You know, and I think a teacher said it best when I was working with them about grading, and they said, Andrew, for so long I've been using grading as a tool for compliance. And you know, it really shifts the conversation from compliance to engagement. And let's be honest, when you take that tool away, right, it's a tool, what are you left with? And that can be really challenging I mean, it was for me, because I used to grade everything, because that's what I did. I assessed the way I was assessed. And I think that that's really hard. And I think what we have to do is, again, as Michelle said, focus on feedback. That is the key there. And I think that it takes time, but maybe reflecting on that and say, you know, do I really need to grade this? Can I share and report it, which is different from grading, in whatever gradebook tool, and say this is where your child is at, or even put in grades and view them as temporary. This is where you're at, but you'll move forward. And I know that you know, Kelly said that knows that it's important with parents. I'd love for you to chime in about that there.
Yeah, just that there needs to be a shift in the parent identity with grading. That so often, you know, we use apps here in DPS that allow parents to see real-time grades, and you know, that's the way that they've been taught and the way that they expect to see the results of what's happening in the classroom. And if we shift that culture to where parents are really connecting with the feedback, the reflections, the more anecdotal work, kids really understanding their goals and next steps, then we can potentially change our practices. Or one or the other needs to happen first. It might be a chicken or the egg thing. But I think that there's some culture shifts that need to happen in terms of what we're letting people know to expect, and what that information should be used for.
It's a long conversation. It takes time. We're not saying you can do it overnight, but I think it's important because if we want our projects to be engaging and have students view them as a growth opportunity, then our assessment practices have to match it.
And you broaden who can assess, right? The culture shift entails too. It's not, the teacher is not the only one who can provide feedback and assess. Students can assess each other. They can assess themselves. Parents can contribute assessment. The community experts and people from our community can also be participants in feedback loops and assessment. And so I think once people see that it's even more powerful to have a broad range of assessment voices brought to the table, I think that helps them feel more comfortable with that shift.
Yeah, that's a good point you brought up, Michelle. So in PBL, assessment is, in a way, it's more real world or more authentic, because in the real world, it's not just like one person assessing you usually. I mean, it could be a supervisor on a job, I suppose, but often there's colleagues involved and people you work with. So I like your idea of bringing in the community, experts. Lots of people are involved in the assessment process, not just a teacher. And important to say peers, not just self and teacher too.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's hear some examples of projects and maybe how teachers did some assess student learning in those projects. And different subjects, and give us a little background, what grade level and so forth the projects you're thinking about came from.
Well, I don't mind starting. One of my favorite projects was watching at New Tech in Napa, watching our 9th grade teachers. It was a biofitness class, so it was an integrated science, health and PE class. And they did a very regional kind of project involving the study of soil samples. And being in Napa, honestly, with the agriculture in the Napa community, it was super relevant. They called it a grape place to learn. And actually, it turns out that anytime a winery is deciding what kind of grapes to plant, they analyze the soil and they write a certain kind of report. And these 9th graders were charged with going on a field trip, analyzing the soil, and writing the same kind of report with the same standards for the scientists that they would be using on their own. And a lot of people said there's no way you can do this project to the standard of expectation that a real person in a real business analyzing soil would. But what we found is, because the scientists and the winery soil experts were the ones that write the report, and they were also the ones assessing the reports, and they were giving feedback along the way, the students accomplished amazing writing samples, and it was real. It was real to them. It felt real to them, and it connected them more deeply to their own community. So I think it's the authentic piece that I find really makes a huge difference in meaningful assessment. So that's one of my favorite examples of the power of assessment. And amazingly, after that project ended, the students continued to seek advice from these community members all year long on all sorts of science questions. So that was they had like a new set of people to turn to for revision as well.
All right, great example. Thanks.
Yeah, I will go because I think that my example is very similar in terms of what the takeaway was. In an elementary school project in 3rd grade, they were doing a project that really revolved around this idea of event planning. So the kids had to do a lot of math integration in terms of planning their budgets and really considering what their numbers were going to be in order to plan this perfect event. And what was really motivating in terms of the assessment was that the teacher in that case was not the one giving the formative assessment feedback. It was event planners that the kids were tapped into as their expert along the way. And the teacher found that even from her giving feedback, that it was less successful than the expert feedback that was being given to the kids. So they really gravitated towards trying to impress this event planner with their expertise in terms of their planning. And I think that brings up this idea that it was a very well-trained community expert that knew how to give feedback. They asked the right types of questions to the kids to make them think, to make them really dig deeper. And that's something that I think we need to be really mindful of when we're involving experts or outsiders in the assessment process, that we want to be really intentional and purposeful with what that feedback might sound like. So we're not giving kids a false impression of how beautiful they're doing if they really have a lot of work to do, and the opposite, that the feedback potentially could be too critical for the level of criticism that kids are able to take in, especially in primary grades. So really being thoughtful as a teacher to plan with the expert in that assessment process of what might this sound like, what types of questions do kids receive well, what might spark that sustained inquiry to really support them when they're providing that feedback. And so that's why I thought that project was just so successful, because the level of engagement with the community expert was so well planned that the assessment became much more meaningful throughout the project.
Good example, Kelly. And I'm curious, did the experts actually use the rubric or develop one with the teacher or with the students?
So it was a little bit, they had the rubric certainly in terms of being able to give feedback as related to the standards, but I think the more intentional training came in the types of questions that would spark that reflection or spark that feedback. So it was a continual conversation between the teacher and the expert to almost train in terms of what kids were ready for.
Okay.
Yeah, one of my favorite projects is actually done by Abby Shore, who's just another national faculty member. And she did a project with her team, and I think this happened maybe a year ago or something, and I got to see parts of it in action. And it was a Digging for Dinosaurs project, and it was second grade, and so they were focusing on literacy components, some math, and then some science. Obviously, you can tell on extinction events and things like that. And so they were trying to figure out, what really happened to the dinosaurs. What do you think happened? And I think what I really took away from that was there were more than one product, so that was okay. Like sometimes we always think we have to come up with like one really big epic kind of product, but in terms of assessing the outcomes they wanted, they actually had to kind of break it up into chunks. And so I thought that was a really great way of thinking about it. And the other thing that I thought was really kind of kept it real for me, and I think keeps it real for other teachers, is that we all have like prescribed curriculum often, our literacy curriculum or math curriculum, and sometimes our science or our textbooks. And what they did is they simply leveraged those tools and those assessment tools. So if there was something that they knew they had to do, for example, it came out of their math investigations unit, they used some of those traditional assessments along the way. So things like exit tickets and things like quizzes, and we often think, oh, those are bad. No, they're not bad. They're great moments to check for understanding, and that those would happen throughout the projects. No, they weren't any sort of final product or authentic product, but they were used as really quick, check-ins to see what students have, punctuation quiz. And that's the other thing, is that they have a high ELL population, so they had really good tools to check for the literacy components to make sure, do students understand the vocabulary? Do they understand the syntax? And so they brought not only content quizzes and checks, but also literacy pieces in there as well.
Okay.
Hearkening back to what Kelly said too about providing a kind of training to the community members who give feedback, the fascinating thing I saw as well is who trains who. I mean, the project I was describing where they were writing the lab analysis report, the soil analysis, what happened was the team teachers set out to train the community member in state standards, but the community member trained them in real world standards, and actually the community member changed the thinking of the educator and broadened their ability to contextualize learning in an authentic way. And so it kind of is like, well, who's training who here? And I found it super valuable for math teachers, because math teachers, if I can pardon me, overgeneralize. They can be so expert in a certain thing that it's hard for them to understand a transference to real world, or even to a transference to kids who just can't get it. But the minute a community member comes in and works with a teacher, and the teacher trains the community member on assessment, there is a back and forth that really changes the educator as well, and brings a context to the assessment. That I just believe in that.
Yeah, a great tip that I would always do, and we would work in teams who were coming up with projects, is we're looking at our content and trying to figure out an authentic context. Is something we did at our school. Is like, if we didn't know, we just started asking friends in the field. We're like, I don't know this as well as I think. So just reaching out to your own friends and your own colleagues in work situations or careers can actually really broaden your thinking maybe more than you thought.
Okay. All right, great point, Michelle. Thanks. We're getting down to our last 5 minutes here or so, and my last question was just any thoughts on common challenges or pitfalls you've seen teachers face in your coaching and or one-on-one workshops you deliver? We mentioned grading already, so we got that challenge. What other common pitfalls or challenges would you see, and ways to overcome them?
I think one that I see related to formative assessment and checking in is when you assess, right, you're going to find that some students get a concept and others that don't, right? That's just how life is. And I think we have to own that and really differentiate based on that. And I think that I made a common mistake. I'd check for understanding, and then I'd find half and half, and I'd do whole group instruction. And I'm like, that's silly because half of them got it. Why am I doing that? And so there's a little bit of fear of letting go. Like, these kids are ready to move on. We can give them the next step or the next task. I'm going to pull these students aside. So it's a challenge because it comes from a fear of letting go. And I know I experienced that personally. So that's one thing.
Okay.
When I was an English teacher, I found that investing energy into helping students learn to evaluate other students' writing reaped greater gains in their ability to improve writing than in teaching them how to write. And so along that lines of relinquishing control, I found that I needed to coach them in how to use an evaluation tool to assess somebody else before they could begin to find their own way through difficult, challenging writing. So I think a pitfall that we want to avoid is that sense of teach it harder, teach it more, when really it can be support, nurture, facilitate, having them maybe evaluate others and get better at evaluating others' work. It's a safer way to maybe extend some growth internally.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Kelly?
I would add that I frequently see a pitfall in the amount of time that's dedicated to the planning of assessments within a project. So we very often latch on to this idea of the actual design of the project, the things that kids are going to do, and the bigger walk away, and we spend a lot of time, reframing our driving questions so that it really, drives it home. But we don't necessarily invest the same amount of time in achieving best practices with an assessment system within a project. So being really purposeful about where, when, how the assessments are going to occur throughout, and then also being willing to be flexible in that process so that we have some things that are going to be really tight, some assessments that we are for sure going to have to embed, but then also knowing that those informal assessments are going to pop up and we might as well take it and do something with it, like Andrew mentioned. The intentionality behind assessments really needs to be there. It needs to be something that if we're going to assess, we need to use it in some way, whether that's to adjust our instruction or to plan differentiation or to help kids create their goals and next steps. So, really just being as intentional with assessments as we are with design.
Okay, all right, thanks, guys. I'll ask for as a final word of goodbye in a minute, but I'll offer one thought that we offer in our workshop to teachers who might be a little bit uncomfortable hearing all this talk about peer assessment, active assessment, and formative and reflective and all this. There's a place for traditional assessment tools also, of course. So if you need to give a quiz to assess students' content knowledge before moving on to the project, even a test maybe toward the end of content knowledge, as well as all the other authentic kinds of assessment you do. It's okay to use those traditional tools too. So, yeah. All right. So our half hour is almost gone by, so thanks a lot, you guys, for great comments. There will be a blog I'll write about this, so you folks out there can read about our conversation, and of course you can watch the Hangout or share it. It'll be on our archive at BIE.org. So let's hear a final word of encouragement, goodbye, or something you forgot to say from our guests.
Focus on formative assessment.
Okay.
I'll add one more thing that I think is important too, just considering the level of rigor with your assessments and how you're going to scaffold that process too, that we don't always just want really simple or really complex assessments, and thinking about a variety of those too.
And my comment would be the same. It's really just the importance of formative, you know, and the opportunity to redo everything, you know, and to build in expectation that there needs to be redo for many kids, and find a way to make that natural.
Okay. All right. Thanks, guys. This has been a great hangout. So I just want to bring up our next hangout so I can tell our viewers to join us in 2 weeks, Tuesday at noon Pacific time here in California. And our hangout, let's see, it's February 23rd. The topic is critique and revision, and that's one of our gold standard PBL essential project design elements, critique and revision. So we'll have more of our national faculty guests in 2 weeks, next Tuesday, 2 weeks from today on Tuesday. So thank you guys very much, and to everybody out there, feel free to ask us questions on our Google Plus events page, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.